Hey Hydrohaven family! In today's guide, we're diving straight into the essentials of composting. Whether you're gardening with soil or hydroponics, composting can make a huge difference in improving plant health and reducing waste. I'm going to walk you through what you need to know as a beginner to get started with composting, and I promise it's not as complicated as it might sound. Let's get into it. What you need to start composting. First, let's talk about the tools and materials you'll need. You don't need fancy equipment to start, just a few basics to make the process easier and more efficient. Composting bin or pile. You need a place to put your compost. You can either buy a compost bin or make your own from scrap materials. If you have the space, you could even just start a compost pile in your yard. A bin keeps things neat, while a pile works fine if you have room and don't mind a little extra mess. For a simple bin, look for one that has airflow holes. Proper airflow is essential for good composting. If you go with a pile, choose a spot that's dry and well drained but not too sunny, as it can dry out too quickly. Green materials, nitrogen-rich. These are your wet materials that break down quickly and provide nitrogen, which is essential for the composting process. Green materials include fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds and filters, grass clippings, green plant trimmings, and eggshells. Break them up into smaller pieces. Green materials should be added in small amounts so you don't end up with a smelly, soggy pile. Aim for a 2-to-1 ratio of brown to green materials to keep things balanced. Brown materials, carbon-rich. Brown materials provide structure and help absorb excess moisture. These materials are essential for creating the perfect environment for microbes to break down the compost. Brown materials include shredded cardboard, straw or hay, dried leaves, wood chips, and shredded newspaper. You'll want a lot more brown material than green, which is why the 2-to-1 brown to green ratio is crucial. Without enough brown material, your compost will become too wet and won't break down properly. Water. Your compost pile needs moisture, but not too much. Think of it like a wrung-out sponge, not soaking but damp. If it's too dry, the composting process slows down. If it's too wet, it'll smell. Water it as needed to keep it damp but not soggy. Aeration. Oxygen is key to fast decomposition. Your compost pile needs to breathe, so make sure there's enough airflow. If you're using a bin, make sure it has ventilation holes. If you're using a pile, turning it occasionally will allow air to get in and speed up the process. Step-by-step process to start composting. Set up your compost area. Find a spot that's out of the way but easy to reach. If you're using a bin, place it directly on the soil to allow worms and microbes to do their job. If you're going with a pile, simply find a corner in your yard with good drainage. Layer your materials. Start by creating a layer of coarse brown materials at the bottom of your compost bin or pile. This will allow air to flow underneath and prevent the pile from becoming too compact. Then, add a layer of green materials on top, followed by more brown materials. Alternate layers of green and brown, making each layer about 3 to 4 inches thick. Remember, the more brown materials you add, the better your compost will break down without getting too wet. Add water. After each layer, lightly water the compost so it stays moist. Aim for the moisture level of a damp sponge, not dripping wet, just enough to keep things moving along. Turn the pile. One of the most important steps in composting is turning the pile. This means mixing up the compost every few weeks to introduce oxygen, which helps the microbes break down the materials faster. You don't have to turn it daily. Every 2 to 3 weeks is fine. Simply grab a garden fork or shovel and mix the compost, bringing the material from the edges into the center. Turning your pile helps prevent bad smells and speeds up the decomposition process. Monitor and adjust. As your compost breaks down, you may notice some areas are too wet or too dry. If it's too wet, add more brown materials like shredded newspaper or dried leaves. If it's too dry, add more green materials or water it lightly. Also check the temperature of the pile. A healthy compost pile should be warm inside, which means the microbes are actively breaking things down. If the temperature drops, it could mean the pile is too dry or has too many brown materials. Knowing what to add to your compost is important because some materials can slow down the process or attract pests. What to add: fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds and tea bags, eggshells, crushed, grass clippings in small amounts, shredded paper or cardboard, dried leaves and straw, weeds before they go to seed, what to avoid, meat, dairy and bones, oily foods or fats, pet waste, diseased plants, weeds with seeds, anything with pesticides or chemicals. These things either slow the breakdown process, make the compost smell, or attract unwanted pests like rats or flies. The time it takes for compost to break down depends on a few factors: temperature, moisture, and the materials you're using. Generally, if you're turning your pile every few weeks and keeping it well watered, it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months for compost to be ready. If you're impatient, you can speed things up by chopping your compost materials into smaller pieces. The smaller the pieces, the quicker they break down. And remember, when your compost is ready, it will look dark, crumbly, and have an earthy smell. Once your compost is ready, it's time to put it to use. Here are some ways you can use it. Soil amendment. If you're growing in soil, mix compost into your garden beds to improve soil structure, fertility, and moisture retention. Mulch. Spread compost around your plants to help retain moisture, keep weeds down, and provide slow-release nutrients. Container gardens. Mix compost with potting soil in containers for extra nutrients. Compost tea. You can make compost tea by steeping some of your compost in water for a few days. This nutrient-rich liquid is great for watering plants. Composting doesn't have to be complicated. Start small, keep your compost balanced with green and brown materials, water regularly, and turn the pile every few weeks to keep things moving. It's a simple, low-cost way to improve your garden or hydroponic setup, and it helps reduce waste at the same time. I hope this guide helps you get started with composting. If you found this helpful, be sure to subscribe to Hydro Haven for more practical gardening tips and sustainable practices. Happy composting and keep those plants growing strong.